brief study on the book of Acts. We're not going to cover the entire thing. We're just going to be covering, if you will, the first section. So the first section of the book of Acts, you will notice in just a little bit that it primarily covers what Peter was doing. It follows the story of Peter, and eventually we start following Paul. We follow his first missionary journey, his second missionary journey, and then also what I just referred to as the third missionary journey, even though most people don't necessarily refer to it as a third missionary journey. But if you think about it, he's still traveling and he's still preaching the gospel. So for introduction today, I'm going to be doing a little bit of the talking, and then we're going to switch over to what we're actually going to be doing. And you'll see that it's more of you going into the scriptures, reading some passages, and then we'll have a time of discussion where we can talk about some of those questions. Okay, so first of all, as I mentioned, just wanted to give you a brief outline. If you were to write an outline of the book of Acts, I'm sure that everybody would come up with something different. So on your sheet over there, you see that I have 4 sections, and the first section is what I call the early church events. So this covers from chapter 1 through chapter 12, verse 25. And we'll see a little bit more about what that looks like in a timeline, if you will. The second section is what we call the first missionary journey. So this is where Paul goes around and starts preaching in different locations. We actually, I believe, have a visit to Jerusalem at some point. But in general, this is what we call the first missionary journey, where Paul goes out and preaches. Then we have the second missionary journey that goes from Acts 15:36 through 21:40. And then we get to what I call, again, the third missionary journey. At this point, Paul is now basically a prisoner, and he is being taken all over the place to meet with different authorities in the Roman Empire, and God is using him to preach to these individuals. So again, this is 4 sections in the book of Acts: early church events, first missionary journey, second missionary journey, third missionary journey. Okay? All right. So just to clarify, we're only going to be covering this quarter the early church events. So chapter 1 through chapter 12, verse 25. I'm not very sure how many of you were here. This is like, I don't know, 7 years ago or so. David Knight did a study on the whole book of Acts. So they covered in 13 weeks the entire book. And they would discuss, little by little, just the different things that are being taught there. I believe he had a book or something, so they were moving along through it. So it's a pretty fast-moving study. I'm hoping that this one, even though it'll still be a little fast, it'll slow down a little bit on just this section. What is going on with the early church from chapter 1 through chapter 12, verse 25. All right, so within that section, we're going to break it down further into 3 sections. So when you start reading the book of Acts, you actually will find out that within this section, there are 3 different times that Peter lands in jail. The first section is found at the end of chapter 3. So what I'm trying to do over here is that the sections, I'm breaking them kind of like leading up to that first imprisonment. So we're going to go from chapter 1 to chapter 3, verse 35. So again, this whole section is leading up to the first arrest of Peter. Then he's set free. And then we start the second section, and we're going to start leading up to the second time that Peter is arrested, which is described in chapter 5, right? But we're going to start from chapter 3 as we start working our way to that event. And then the third time that Peter is imprisoned appears in chapter 12. But again, we're going to start from chapter 6, and we're going to start walking our way to that event. So hopefully that helps break down the passage into, if you will, a little bit easier way to follow. So remember, we have 4 big sections of the book of Acts. We're going to focus on the first section, and then we're going to break it down into 3 individual subsections, leading up to the first arrest of Peter, second arrest of Peter, third arrest of Peter, and essentially starting in verse 26 of chapter 12, that's when we start the first missionary journey. So we're not going to cover that this quarter, but we're going to cover everything behind. So a little bit of context as to why we're not going to cover the whole thing. So I was starting my Sunday school with the young men. We couldn't find someone to help us teach this quarter, so I was asked, hey, would you be willing to teach the third quarter of the year? And I said, yes, for sure. And I thought, well, maybe I should redo something and try to come up with something that is specific to this. But then I was like, well, why don't we just do it? That way All of us can participate. The young guys can understand how we can have this discussion, about the Bible. And then when we go back to having our Sunday school, then we continue going on the book of Acts. If it happens that we can't have another person to come in for the last quarter of the year, I'm happy to continue going with this. The material is ready. But that's the whole reason we're going to be stopping short, if you will, from studying the whole book of Acts. However, my prayer is that the young guys and I will be able to do that. Okay. So you will see on the sheet, you have a second page that we're going to be trying to address three different things as we are studying like if you will, the different subsections or mini sections for each section that leads up to an imprisonment. So we're going to be trying to identify what are the key places where these events are taking place, right? Where is this happening? Then we're also going to try to write down who are the different people who are involved in all of these events that are being described. And finally, we're going to make some key observations. What are some of the key lessons that we can gather from this passage that we can take and apply in our lives? So that's essentially the format that we're going to have every single day for these 13 weeks that we have. Where are we in geographically? Who are the people who are involved in this event? And what are some of the key lessons that we can learn? All right, so this section over here that we're going to be covering, the way that you can identify the chronology of it, when we start in chapter 1, you find out that Jesus is is basically ascending to heaven, and Luke tells us that. He's going to ascend to heaven. So this is shortly after he was crucified, and he resurrected on the third day, and then he appeared for a space of about 40 days, right? And then he's taken up to heaven. This section over here, you'll notice in Acts chapter 12 that essentially it ends with the death of King Agrippa. So who's King Agrippa? And was he a good guy or was he a really bad guy? A super nice, humble man, right? No, he's not a very nice man. So who can tell me a little bit about why he ends up dying, if you recall that story? And if you don't remember, that's fine. We can go to Acts, or were you going to say something?
The worms?
Yes. Now, he was being so humble. He was being so trying to not get attention on himself. So let's go together to the book of Acts, chapter 12. So this event comes right after Peter is let free from prison. So let me just read that section starting in verse 20, chapter 12. Now, he was very angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon. This is the king. And with one accord they came to him, and having won over Blastus, the king's chamberlain, they were asking for peace because their country was fed by the king's country. On one appointed day, Herod, having put on his royal apparel, took his seat on the rostrum and began delivering an address to them. The people kept crying out, "The voice of God and not of a man." And immediately an angel of the Lord struck him because he did not give God the glory. And he was eaten by worms and died. But the word of the Lord continued to grow and to be multiplied. So this is essentially where we're going to pause, where we're going to stop this section, right? So we are going to begin with the ascension to heaven of the Lord Jesus to the time that Agrippa dies. Now,
So King Agrippa, I think the names mix up sometimes. He's the same guy as Herod.
Herod Agrippa. Yeah, I think that's usually how he's recognized, yes. And I can double check that. Yeah. But essentially, like you can see that this is a period that goes from about 32. This is around the time when Jesus is crucified. And then you go 40 days later, that's when he ascends to heaven. And then we know from historical data that Herod dies around 44 AD. So it's like a space of about 15-ish years. Yes?
It's also true that there are multiple Herods.
Yes, there are. I mean, even in the time of Jesus when he was born, there's a Herod. So yeah, there's several. So we can identify them a little bit better if you want more context on those. Yes, I think that is the case. Yeah, so there's several. They're just named the same. It would be easier if they just make it easier for us, but but yeah, go ahead.
I think there were 3 sons.
Yes, yeah, and
It's called an heir.
Yeah.
Israel, different parts of Israel.
Yeah.
It is pretty important that
Yeah.
we know which one we're talking about.
For sure, for sure. And they were all really nice too. Very kind people. Not at all. Yeah, just remember that one of those actually intended to kill Jesus when he was a baby. So that tells you how unkind they were. I mean, even one of those, right? I mean, if I recall, I may be forgetting, but I believe one of those even killed one of his siblings, just because he wanted it out of the way. So really, really terrible individuals. And we see here again an individual that is so proud that he's stricken by an angel. So again, we are going to be talking from a little bit, I would say 32 AD to about 44 AD. So it's a small period of time, but there's a lot going on over here. There's a lot of activity going on. Now, where do you think most of the events are going to be happening in this specific section? Like geographically, where do you think most of the events are going to take place? In Jerusalem, right? And we're going to identify why that is, because, I mean, technically the book of Acts should be covering all kinds of different places, not just Jerusalem, but there's a purpose for that. There's a reason for that, and we're going to cover that, some of it today. Okay, so if you can go to your first sheet. Today we're going to be doing an exercise of what we're going to be doing the rest of the time. We may not be able to finish it today, but we can continue next week, and then we'll be in track to complete our 13 weeks of studying this section of the book of Acts. So, if you would go with me there to your sheet over there, we're going to be covering Luke's brief recap of what happened. So we're going to be covering from verses 1 through 11. You will see that I have a few questions for you that I would like to address if you are curious where we're going to go next on this first lead up to Peter's arrest. You see that we have Luke's brief recap, then the election of Matthias, the day of Pentecost, and then Peter and John's boldness. So those are the 4 topics that we're going to be covering essentially this month, and then we'll move on to the other topics. But if you go to your sheet, right, we have there a little timeline. We have key places, key people, key lessons, and I have 3 questions for you over there. So what I would like for all of us to do is just to take a little bit of time. I'm thinking, well, it's a shorter Sunday school, and again, we can't finish this today, but we're going to take about 10 minutes for you to go in, look at the verses that I left for you over there, look them up, and try to write down some of these things. But I really would like, if we could do this, and I strongly encourage, if you can find a partner that you can work with so that you can have a discussion, and if you have questions, you can be like, I'm not very sure that I've ever read this before. That way you can help each other. So again, I'm going to set a timer for 10 minutes. I meant to have some little music in the background playing. I just didn't have time to choose something. Next time I will, so it's not so awkward that we're just all quietly here. But let's go ahead and spend 10 minutes looking at Acts chapter 1, verses 1 through 11, and as best as you can, try to fill in those questions. What are the key places? Who are the key people? And then answer those 3 questions over there, and then we will have a moment of discussion. And again, if you can pair up with someone, that would be amazing. So go ahead. Maybe I can find something nice over here. I don't know if you can hear, but there we go. All right. Well, let's start working our way to. It is green now. So let's start with working our way through this now. Okay. So it was not a question I asked over there. I already have the answer over there. But we're saying then that from the time that Jesus raises from the dead, right, there are 40 days, as the book of Acts says, where Jesus is appearing to the apostles here and there, right? And what is it that Luke says, like, how is Jesus appearing to these 11 apostles? What is he doing as he's appearing every time? It says with convincing proofs, right? So he is. What do you think they needed that? What do you think the 11 apostles needed a convincing proof that this, in fact, was Jesus that was appearing? Yeah, I mean, and yeah, they watched him die, but then also, like, very early they also saw him, right? I mean, one of them even put his finger on his side. Yes.
Well, they really thought that he, as the Messiah, was going to set up. They didn't understand what was going on, and all of a sudden, this guy who was going to be their hero and defeat the Romans had died.
Mm-hmm.
And Peter, well, I'm going back fishing.
Yeah. Yep.
I'm not fishing for men.
Yeah.
He didn't know what to do.
Yep.
This whole world caved in.
Yeah, and then also, like, whenever, I mean, at least we have an instance, right, or two instances where Jesus, like, just poof, appears in the room and everybody's like, what's going on? And then as soon as he's done speaking, poof, he disappears again. It's like, you don't see him again for several days. It's like, what's going on? Like, yes, I think that there's some confusion, so I think Jesus had to make sure that these individuals still knew, this whole thing is still going on. This is all real, and he's appearing to them over a period of 40 days. Okay. So then we go into the passage that we're going to be talking about. So key places. Where is this passage taking place? And you find that in Acts chapter 1, verse 12. Like where Jesus is speaking. In Jerusalem, more specifically in the Mount of Olives, right? Now we're going to find out in a little bit the importance of the Mount of Olives. But let's talk about the people. So who are the different individuals that essentially form part of this narrative right now? They play some part of a role in this description of Acts chapter 1, verses 1 through 11. So who are the individuals that show up over here? Okay, so we have the disciples, and who else do we have? Jesus, right? So we have the Lord Jesus, because he's the one who's doing the speaking. We have the disciples, or the 11 apostles, and who else shows up at the end? Yeah. So we have two men in white. And what role do these men in white play? Yeah, it's just like, well, just as you saw him leave, he will return in the same way. Almost also kind of like saying, it's like, you guys can go on and move on with what you need to do, right? Can you imagine how incredible this sight would have been? That you're talking with Jesus and then all of a sudden clouds just take him up. I mean, like, it would be astonishing to see something like that. It would be incredible. And one of the things that Mr. Tim mentioned is that in their mind, they're still thinking like, well, is this it? Is this the end? Is this where it all finishes and he comes back in like 5 minutes with all his army and defeats and gives us the victory? Like, and that is their big question. So we will answer that here in just a moment. But first, let's answer the first question. So what is the historical and prophetic significance of the Mount of Olives? And I gave you there multiple passages, some that you can just like basically combine. They give you the same story. But what is the significance of the Mount of Olives? Just some of the things that you found from those verses.
In Zechariah, that's where Jesus is coming back.
Yeah. In Zechariah, it tells us that Jesus is going to return. And there's a key little mention over there. What is that going to look like? So when he descends, like it says that his feet, right, are going to touch the mountain. And then there's also something that is going to happen. I don't know if you guys had a chance to read the entire thing. I know it's a... Yeah, so the Mount of Olives is going to be split apart in two, right? and it's going to create a giant valley. It says that the mountain is going to be moved, right? It's going to be like stretched, and then it's going to create a valley where the people who are living in Jerusalem, we know from other passages that half of them are going to die in the city, half of them are going to be able to run over there. And then it says that the Lord is going to fight for his people, right? So there's that key prophetic event, something that is going to happen way in the future, right? When Jesus returns. And again, it's just an incredible thing. I was trying to get an idea of like how large the Mount of Olives. Like in my mind, the Mount of Olives is just like a little mountain, but it's a pretty big, like, I don't know what you call it. I mean, in Mexico, I guess we call it like the Sierra. It's like a big section, prolonged section of mountain, and that whole thing is just going to whack, and then whoop, it's going to be split apart. And it's going to create a ginormous valley where people are going to be able to run for escape, and Jesus is going to be there to protect them, to save them. Okay, now, how many of you read the passage in 2 Samuel 15:30? What does it say? So we're going back in time. Yes? Yep, and yes, Absalom takes over the kingdom, right? And all the advisors of David are saying, like, you need to leave. We need to go because he's going to kill you. And he is leaving, right? And he's crying, and it says that he's mourning. But there's a very specific sentence over there that caught my attention. If we can go there to 2 Samuel 15:30, and this relates a little bit or a lot to what we're going to talk about next on the other verses in the New Testament. So if you can go with me to 2 Samuel chapter 15. And you guys, if you know what I'm talking about, if you guys kind of have an idea of where I'm going with this, feel free to jump in. You don't have to wait for me. So 2 Samuel 15, verse 30. There's a little sentence over there that says, just a second. David went up the ascent of the Mount of Olives and wept as he went, and his head was covered and walked barefoot. Then all the people who were with him each covered his head and went up weeping with him. Now some told David, saying, Ahithophel is among the conspirators. Oh, did I miss that verse? So sorry about that. I thought I had it over here. Yeah, that's it. So 32, it happened as David was coming to the summit, and this is the sentence, where God was worshipped, that behold, Hushai and the Archite met him with coat torns and dust on his head. So it's interesting to me that at the top of this mountain, people worshipped God, right? I mean, it's oh, good morning. It's good to see you. So it has this statement over there. This is where people worshipped God. But essentially, as soon as Absalom takes over, that worship basically ceases. It'll be restored later on by another descendant of David in the near future. But then who comes and worships God in this mountain every single time that he has the chance? Jesus. Where? Like where do we find that? What was that? Yeah, and I give you the verses. Like you can see every single time that Jesus had been on this mountain, and one of the things that he does when he is in Jerusalem, every opportunity he gets, he goes into that mountain and he prays and worships the Lord. So to me, it's just a pretty interesting connection, right? So way back then, people used to worship God at the top of the mountain. At some point, all of that falls apart. Then Jesus comes, and every single time that he's in Jerusalem, he makes time to go to the Mount of Olives to praise the Lord. What is another of the events that happens at the Mount of Olives? Like when Jesus is there, this is a key event right before his crucifixion. Huh? Well, I guess yes. Like I guess that's like almost immediately before. Yeah. So he's in prayer when he's arrested, right?
That's the Garden of Gethsemane. That's not Mount Olives.
Sorry. Yeah, the Garden of Gethsemane. You're right. But I'm talking more like something that happens, like is something that we celebrate here right before Easter. We sometimes have palms and. Right? It says that Jesus is descending from the Mount of Olives, and he's making his way into Jerusalem, and all the people are saying, Hosanna, Hosanna, and recognizing him as the son of David. Right? So when we make this connection, right, of the Mount of Olives and Jesus descending from it and going into the city, right, at this point, as he is descending, he gives the instructions to his disciples. You will find this colt tied. You go grab it, and if the owners say, what are you doing? You say, the Lord has need for it. And they go and do it, and it happens that the owner comes and says, like, what are you guys doing? And he says, the Lord has need for it. And he's just like, okay. And then they set Jesus on the colt, and he walks into the city. That's a huge deal. That's a huge event. But I think when we go back then to this passage in Zechariah, where Jesus is descending, it tells us there, as you keep reading in the passage of Zechariah, that Jesus is going to be ruling in Jerusalem. So essentially, there's going to be a second triumphal entry, if you will, and the Mount of Olives plays a key role into all of that, which is, again, a pretty amazing, what Pastor Ed used to say, right? Like the near future fulfillment of Scripture and then the far fulfillment of the Scripture. So we need to be looking for things like this that we're like, man, this is cool that we have clues in the Bible of what this is going to look like in the future. Yes.
Reverend, I just mentioned this past week that in Luke 22, verse 39, it says, coming out, he went to the Mount of Olives as he was accustomed.
Mm-hmm.
They did this on a regular basis. That was the Garden of Gethsemane.
Okay.
There, it's part of that mountain anyway.
Yeah, I guess, and it's like a huge mountain. I didn't realize. I always thought it was like this little thing. It's just like this like huge range.
The Garden of Gethsemane was part of the Mount of Olives.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's when they prayed, and 3 times. So that's
Yeah.
amazing. I didn't know that.
I didn't realize that either until you actually see the pictures. You actually see it's like a range, and it's funny because it kind of like converges into 3. Like there's 3 ranges that come, and so yeah, like the skirts of it, I think that's where the Garden of Gethsemane is, and I've seen pictures of it. It's beautiful, but yeah, so like I don't necessarily know why the Bible like differentiates between the two. I guess it's easier to say Garden of Gethsemane, but it's part of the Mount of Olives, like closer to like the skirts of it. So, but it's really close to where Jesus was crucified. So yes, okay. So we don't have time for the other questions, but next week we're going to answer those. For your sheets, I put the little punch holes. So if you want to keep those in a binder or something, that'd be amazing. That way you can keep that for the future. Thank you very much. We'll see you next week, Lord willing.